Hi, beautiful friends. It's David Ault. Welcome to the gathering. I've been thinking a lot recently about my friend Mike, and it made me realize that for many, many, many years, I've held this belief that I failed him. I used to live in Los Angeles. In fact, I was there for almost a quarter of a century, and I remember making the decision to move. I needed to be somewhere that was in closer proximity to my birthplace and where my mom still lived. She was elderly, and there was a lot of increasing needs that were happening, and it just felt easier to do that. And so Mobile, Alabama was the choice. And all of my friends in the California area were like, "What are you doing?" And I remember it felt like I was dummying down. That was their perspective. And admittedly, it was a little bit of mine until I got there and I got settled. And that's where I met Mike. And I did not move there to start a spiritual community. But after a year there and a bunch of fascinating encounters, um, we opened up a Centers for Spiritual Living. And it was an amazing experience. In fact, there was no dummying down. It was the exact opposite. The people that showed up there, the people that participated, and the heart and the sweat equity that went into creating this really wonderful community there was so enriching and so heartfelt. And Mike and his wife were a part of that community. Mike had been falsely imprisoned for 28 years. By the time I had met him, he had only been out in the world for a couple of years. He would still struggle with an institutionalized mindset, things like ATM cards and um, getting cash out of those things and other technological advances just were completely out of the scope of his understanding. And yet he was not stupid. He was one of the smartest people I ever met. Imagine 28 years being falsely imprisoned. And one of the things that Mike would do would read, and any book he could get his hands on, it didn't matter what the subject was, he would devour it. And so, in the course of that time, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of books of every topic imaginable he had read. And it was still a struggle. It was still a struggle. But his story and the false imprisonment and the government corruption and all of those things made for a really, really great movie. And that's exactly what was happening. In fact, a whole team had positioned themselves in Mobile around Mike, where some of them were living in his house with his wife, and they were around him. There was a writers' research team that was accessing the libraries and local archives about the court case and the corruption. The fascinating part was that some of the people who were in the corruption were still in government. The technicians were there, the people who do all of the site visits and decision making with regards to filming were there. This thing was moving along, including the director, and his name was David Bushell. And what was just wild, again, complete opposite of dummying down, was that they would come to church. This burgeoning new thing that we were creating, they were coming every Sunday, sitting themselves all around Mike and his wife. And I had to laugh at the irony of that because having been an actor for so long, I would have done anything to be in the proximity of this high caliber quality of people. To be with David Bushell, he had directed Sling Blade. He had been a producer for The Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. He went on to direct the Dallas Buyers Club, a bunch of other movies, Academy Award winning. And here they were every Sunday in church. And then David would call me and we would meet at the newly opened Panera. And we would sit and not only would we talk about Mike, but we would also talk about some of the things that I had said on Sunday. I mean, it just was so funny how those situations had sort of reversed themselves. And without trying or having released all of that, here it was in my lap. But I would spend a lot of time with Mike. But, the goal is to sort of create this protective bubble around him because here was this Hollywood team very much invested in the story. That meant that they needed a happy ending. And the pressure from the studios and from all these people who were now living in Mobile uh, to guarantee them a happy ending was, now that I think about it, just ridiculous. But that's the way were moving along. And they were asking me to help them. And not that I didn't want to be around Mike because I loved him. He was like this teddy bearish, beautiful, open-hearted sponge that wanted to learn. And he would take me fishing. And I had never been fishing probably since childhood. And here I was, in Mike's boat out in the Mobile Bay, having these discussions about maybe something that I had said at the spiritual center, or he was trying to take class and he was confused about this, but they were heartfelt. And then he would tell things to me and share things with me about life and experience and his perspective that would just blow me away. And fast forward, ultimately, it just wasn't enough of a guarantee for the Hollywood system. And as delightful as it was to have that sort of buzz around, they eventually had to pack up and leave. And they were still going to keep the project door open, but so much of that now had to become more self-perpetuating from Mike and his wife. And I would even say a little bit then fell into this idea that I had to help keep this moving, this vision of Mike's success and his sobriety and all of the other things to be moving in a forward trajectory, whatever that meant. And that kind of stuff isn't sustainable because that's not what we're here to do. It is a false idea to think that we can fix anyone. What we can do is return back to the whole reason for being, and that is to remember what we are. And I say what we are, then in terms of being an instrument, in terms of being a vessel. And the only thing for us is to remember that what we are is this vastness that is beyond comprehension, so we are individualized. We are this sort of relative temporary thing absorbed in this one. And the whole thing, the whole object then is that in this relativity, in this instrument, to remember that we are one, not to make someone else remember, not to fix their circumstances to align with what we think things are supposed to look like, but to free ourselves from all of that, to free ourselves from the identity that we are the fixer. My God, what an egoic thing, right? And yet, even now, I will find myself slipping into this practice of thinking, maybe not consciously, but thinking about how can I make this better for someone, something external, rather than dropping all of that and returning back to my only my only objective here is to remember and to allow more of that oneness to filtrate its way into this individualization as much as possible. So I wasn't doing any of that. I was caught up in this thing of fixing him. And my life circumstances and evolution was such that my time in Mobile had come to completion. And it wasn't shortly after I had moved that Mike's struggle with his alcoholism kind of overcame him. And many, many things sort of returned. That institutionalized mindset sort of came back and kind of reminded me of that character in the movie Shawshank Redemption, the older Jason Robarbs, I believe it was, that got released from prison, and then the outside world was too much and he wanted to go back to what was familiar. And so he did something in order to be convicted so he could go back to prison. And we all do that when we get so frightened by letting go of the roles of the fixer, or the roles that we have carved out that say this is what we are, that determine the can'ts and the cans. I can't do this, I can do this. Not even realizing that by doing that, the limitation and the squeezing of how that clouds the objective to remember what we are, takes over, and we many times in these multiple lifetimes never remember that. And so we will find ourselves in circumstances, or even probably being the people that are creating the circumstances, so that we can go back into being the fixer because that's what's familiar. And as I thought about Mike, and I thought about this long held belief that I had failed, I began to sort of forgive myself with holding that thought, and that recognizing and even thanking that presence of Mike for being a teacher to me, and being a part that sort of helps me return home, you know. Um, it made me reflect on Louise Hay, my spiritual mom, and how unfailingly, no matter whether it was a local gathering or traveling with her on the road, she always began with these words: I'm not a healer. I am simply providing a space where healing can occur. I didn't appreciate the wisdom in what she said back then. I do today. And it's sort of a North Star reminder to me to check myself when I think that I am the one who is doing something, and to remember that my only role is to do whatever it is that I can within this vessel, this temporary vessel, to be the atmosphere whereby if anyone wants to come up for air, if anyone wants to reach out and stretch the boundaries of what it feels like to dissolve identities, um, if they desire to do that, that they can do that safely around me, or whatever this atmosphere is. It's just whatever it is that this vessel, this temporary vessel called David, can do to be a catalyst to help end any kind of level of suffering, even if it's the suffering of holding on to a thought, then that's what we're all here to do. And finally, that old phrase that was always puzzling to me, and that was, if you see the Buddha on the road, kill him. Boy, I didn't know what that meant. And it wasn't until I began to, more explore the deeper meaning behind that and the origin of that. It's that the Buddha in that particular little verse means any kind of external authority or doctrine, or even a teacher that any of us cling to for final answers. It's that codependency. you will, on organizational religion or even organizational spirituality, that ultimately the bigger leap into waking up, the bigger leap into remembering is that each of those things are sort of atmospheric assistants, if you will, but they're not the end all be all. They are stops along the way. And that the codependency that I held in thinking that I could be the one that would fix Mike, that the idea of a movie being made about his life would guarantee some Hollywood ending for Mike, is all kinds of muddled codependency. That really what we are to do is to just be this atmosphere, to let that which is Buddha consciousness or Christ consciousness or oneness have more and more and more permission to be within us, to give us more and more insight to what it feels like to let go of the roles and the identities as the fixer or as the one who needs to be fixed, so that we can all continue to feel more and more and more, to remember more and more and more the true essence of what we are. And so, in a way, Mike helped me do that. I had to smile and to think, sometimes again, I get caught up into thinking that this storyline as David is the total picture, and it's not. Sometimes there are people like Mike's who come in perhaps to shake our own egoic actions, to shake us up in a way that we finally reach a point where we see our fallacies, we see our arrogance, and we just might give ourselves permission to let all of that go. Blessings.